Welcome to Sleepless Scientist, the channel where science whispers softly into the quiet corners of your night. If you've ever wanted to fall asleep to the rhythmic story of biology, astronomy, or quantum oddities, you're in the right place. Tonight, let's drift into one of the most profound stories science can tell. A tale that begins not in deep space or ancient oceans, but in you. More precisely, in what you once were. Tonight, we'll be telling the story of how a single microscopic cell becomes a human being. A transformation so staggering in scale and complexity that even the most skeptical minds pause in awe. Thank you for watching this video. I do apologize if this makes you more awake than sleepy. If it does, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting with where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, let's gently descend into the world of the beginning of life. Not the origin of life itself, but your origin, mine. Everyone's. Once upon a time, you were one. Just one cell. Not one among many. Literally just one. A single fertilized egg. A zygote. A sphere no bigger than a pinprick, floating in the quiet confines of a fallopian tube. This zygote didn't know it yet, but it held the entire blueprint. For you, all your organs, all your thoughts, your fingerprints, your ability to like or dislike pineapple on pizza. All packed inside 46 chromosomes, divided into about 20,000 genes. Stitched from over 3 billion DNA letters, that zygote was already extraordinary. It was made when a single sperm cell, a streamlined missile with just one mission, found and fused with an egg cell, a much larger orb, patiently waiting. Out of hundreds of millions of sperm cells competing in a frantic biological race, only one made it through. One winner. And from that singular microscopic union, the human symphony began. Within hours, that zygote started dividing. First into 2 cells, then 4, then 8, then 16. It wasn't just playing a game of copy and paste. It was orchestrating a drama. Every division came with tiny but meaningful differences. Like identical twins gradually deciding they actually prefer different hairstyles. The early divisions were symmetrical and deceptively simple. But behind the scenes, cellular machinery was already sorting molecules like a librarian reorganizing an infinite library in fast forward. The cluster of cells grew into what biologists call a morula, a ball of cells that looks, quite literally, like a blackberry under a microscope. The morula transformed into a blastocyst, a hollow sphere of about 100 cells, with a fluid-filled cavity and an inner group of cells tucked inside. That little group, the inner cell mass, was the origin of your entire body. The cells on the outer shell would form the placenta, the lifeline between embryo and mother. At about a week old, the blastocyst burrowed itself into the uterus wall, like a determined little mole, where it would embed and begin to truly build. This was implantation, a risky process. Many embryos never make it past this point, but if yours did, congratulations. You had just secured real estate in the uterine lining, and the development game was officially on. By day 14, the inner cell mass began reshaping itself. It wasn't just a blob anymore. It was organizing into 3 distinct layers: the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. These would become your outer parts, like skin and nervous system, your middle parts, like bones and muscles, and your innermost linings, like lungs and intestines. This process was called gastrulation, and it is, quite frankly, one of the most magnificent construction blueprints life has ever rolled out. In just 3 weeks, something remarkable happened. A primitive streak appeared, the first visible sign of your body axis. Think of it as the zip line on which the rest of your form would unfold. The cells along this axis began to fold and specialize. From a flat disk of cells, your body began curling in 3 dimensions, forming a tube that would eventually become your spinal cord and brain. By week 4, you were still just a few millimeters long, but already had the beginnings of a heart. A simple tube began contracting. It wasn't beating to emotions, of course. No heartbreaks or butterflies yet. But it was pulsing, regularly, methodically. It was your first rhythm, your first biological soundtrack. And it marked the beginning of your cardiovascular system. Around this time, small protrusions formed limb buds, tiny stubs that would become arms and legs. You didn't have hands yet, but your cells were already deciding where your fingers would go. Meanwhile, the tiny neural tube at your back end began differentiating. Some parts would become the brainstem, others the cerebral cortex. You wouldn't think conscious thoughts for months, but already the blueprint for memory, personality, and dreams was sketching itself in electrochemical whispers. By week 5, your face began forming. Small mounds of tissues swelled where eyes, nose, and mouth would later bloom. It's hard to believe that what would one day smile, cry, and frown began as a swirl of indistinct bulges. Your eyes didn't yet have pupils. Your mouth didn't have a tongue. But the instructions for all of it were ticking inside every nucleus, like a biological countdown. Week 6 was when you began to look just a little less alien. Cartilage began forming in your limbs. Your fingers started to separate. You no longer resembled a sea creature quite so much. Your jaw, already outlined in code, began forming small tooth buds. Your inner ear began to curl into shape.
You were
Still tiny, under a centimeter long, but astonishingly complex. Your internal organs were also revving up. The liver began producing blood cells. The kidneys formed primitive structures. The pancreas took its place. Even your intestines began to twist themselves into loops. Your body was setting up shop, designing itself like a pop-up city with no outside architect. At week 7, your limbs lengthened. Bones began to calcify. The cells in your arms and legs followed intricate growth instructions, guided by gradients of molecules known as morphogens. Little chemical traffic signs shouting, "Go left." Grow up, shrink here, elongate there. By now, you were only the size of a blueberry, but packed with hundreds of millions of cells, each with a task, a function, a destiny. By week 8, your status officially changed. You were no longer called an embryo. You were a fetus. And while you weren't yet capable of kicking, crying, or waving, you had the hardware to start growing into someone who could. All of this, from the moment of fertilization to this point, had taken about 2 months. 2 months for a microscopic to become a creature with eyes, ears, a spine, and a tiny but beating heart. It's difficult not to feel awe at the precision of this unfolding. How did your cells know what to become and when? They didn't think. They didn't decide. They followed rules encoded in DNA, modified by signals from their neighbors. It was like building a cathedral with no blueprints, just bricks that knew when and where to become stained glass or flying buttresses. And here's a funny thing. While you were becoming you, you were also forming a tail. Yes, for a brief time, you had one. Not a long swinging one, but a stubby little nub that would eventually be absorbed into your spinal column. That's evolution's legacy, a reminder that we come from creatures who once needed tails to balance or swing. Now, as you neared the end of the 2nd month, your face became more defined. Your eyelids began to form. Your nose became visible, and your upper lip developed its curve. Inside your mouth, your palate started forming. You were becoming not just a human organism, but a human face. A face with potential for infinite expressions, memories, and recognition. By now, you were just a little over 2 centimeters long, about the size of a jelly bean, but composed of over 1 billion cells, each humming along in coordinated harmony. These cells weren't just building your body. They were also quietly preparing your brain. In fact, the brain was growing at such a rate it made up nearly half of your total weight. In the coming weeks, your body would straighten, your arms would bend at the elbows, and your bones would begin to harden. But already, the foundation was laid. From a single, undifferentiated cell, a whole person was emerging. The process wasn't just biology. It was a miracle in motion. Not a supernatural one, but a natural one, so astonishing it might as well be magic. By the beginning of week 9, your body was lengthening rapidly. Your neck was forming, allowing your head, still disproportionately large, to lift slightly from your chest. Your tiny toes had separated fully, and your arms could now flex at elbows and wrists. The cartilage scaffolding of your skeleton was beginning to convert into bone through a process called ossification, quietly preparing the strength you would one day use to run, climb, or hold a pencil. You were still just a few grams in weight, no bigger than a strawberry, yet your inner universe had become astoundingly intricate. Your liver took over red blood cell production from the yolk sac. Your gallbladder, a future overseer of digestion, had taken shape. Your kidneys were beginning to produce urine. Meanwhile, in your developing brain, thousands of new neurons were being created every minute. The neural connections, or synapses, that would eventually carry thoughts and dreams and awkward teenage angst were beginning to whisper their early messages. Week 10 saw the refinement of what had already been built. Your eyelids fused shut to protect your developing eyes and would remain sealed until around week 26. Your ears, once mere indentations on the side of your head, moved closer to their final position. Your tiny fingers developed nails. Inside your mouth, tooth buds for both your baby teeth and some of your future adult teeth were quietly forming, like rows of plans waiting for a construction schedule. As week 11 arrived, you were about 5 centimeters long. Your limbs could bend, and your body had started to stretch and uncurl. You might have even begun to move, not in a coordinated dance, but in spontaneous twitches and flutters caused by immature muscle contractions and nerve signals experimenting with connectivity. Your diaphragm began to move in what looked like tiny practice breaths, even though there was no air to inhale. You were training for a world you hadn't yet entered. By now, your vocal cords were forming, although you wouldn't make a sound. Until months later, your intestines, which had temporarily extended outside your body into the umbilical cord due to lack of abdominal space, began to move back inside your abdomen, a sort of internal housewarming. The brain was undergoing such rapid development that your forehead bulged to accommodate it, giving you a profile that would eventually soften with time. By week 12, the end of the first trimester, your form had become unmistakably human. Your face had a recognizable shape. Your bones were visible on ultrasound scans. Your reflexes were beginning to show a startle response, a curling of the fingers, a squirm in response to pressure. Though still far from conscious thought, your body was beginning to interact with its environment in subtle, mechanical ways. Your bone marrow, a blood cell factory for life, had started to form. Your pancreas could now begin producing insulin. And although no one could hear it yet, your tiny heartbeat thudded steadily at about 120 to 160 beats per minute, roughly double the average adult rate. The placenta, that temporary organ built just for you, had fully taken over supplying oxygen and nutrients. In the following weeks, your size would increase dramatically. By week 14, you had grown to about 8.5 centimeters, roughly the length of a lemon, and you weighed nearly 40 grams. While your mother might not have felt it yet, you were making small, active movements. Your face now had the muscles necessary for expressions. You could squint, frown, even grimace, though it's unclear whether you had anything to be grumpy about. Inside your head, billions of neurons were forming networks, though not yet capable of consciousness. Your brain was laying the physical infrastructure for sensation, motion, and eventually, thought. Meanwhile, your digestive system was rehearsing. You could swallow amniotic fluid and begin to practice peristalsis, the wave-like motion that would one day push food through your intestines. Week 15 brought more subtle changes. Your scalp sprouted the earliest signs of hair. Your skin, still translucent, began producing a thin, protective layer. Your kidneys were producing urine, excreted into the amniotic sac around you, a system that sounds strange but was a necessary rehearsal for postnatal kidney function. Inside your limbs, your bones continued to harden. You could now make a fist. You might even suck your thumb. By week 16, your skeletal system had developed enough that your movements could be detected on an ultrasound. You were about the size of an avocado and had started developing fat stores beneath your skin. Brown fat, a special kind of heat-producing tissue essential for newborn survival, was accumulating near your neck, chest, and back. This insulation would be critical in the chill of the outside world. At week 17, your body was covered in a waxy, cheese-like substance called vernix caseosa, a strange but important coating that protected your delicate skin from the long bath. You were taking in amniotic fluid. Without it, you'd emerge looking like a prune. Around this time, your ears had developed enough that you could hear muffled sounds, a heartbeat, blood rushing, the occasional muffled voice or music from the outside world. Your fingerprints were now unique and fully formed, an identity etched into your skin long before your birth certificate. Your brain's hemispheres were continuing to expand. And while you were still too immature to think, the roads of cognition were being paved. By week 18, you were stretching out to about 14 centimeters long. Your reflexes had grown sharper. Your legs had lengthened, catching up to your previously longer arms. You could kick and roll, even if your mother couldn't always feel it. Your bones were becoming visible through ultrasound imaging, especially the long bones like the femur. Inside your skull, a forest of connections was being woven in the brain. Connections that one day would allow you to recognize a face, solve a puzzle, or recite song lyrics with suspicious accuracy. Week 19 saw your sensory systems become more active. Taste buds had developed on your tongue. And while you weren't sampling cuisine in the womb, you could begin to detect subtle differences in the amniotic fluid depending on what your mother ate. The foundations of your nervous system were refining. Nerves were becoming encased in myelin, a fatty sheath that improved signal speed and efficiency. Myelin would continue developing well into your 20s, perhaps explaining why teenagers often struggle with long-term planning. By the halfway point, at week 20, you weighed nearly 300 grams and measured about 25 centimeters from head to toe. An ultrasound scan would now show a profile with discernible features: a forehead, a nose, lips that could move, even the occasional hiccup. Your heartbeat could be heard with a stethoscope. Your uterus had formed if you were female, and your testes had begun to descend if male. Your limbs were now coordinated enough that you could grab your own face or reach toward the umbilical cord. You were still small enough to float freely within the amniotic sac, surrounded by a cushion of fluid that protected you from external shocks and provided a comfortable buffer for your movements. You weren't conscious of your own body yet, but the systems that would one day allow for self-awareness, the somatosensory cortex, the limbic system, the thalamus, were maturing steadily. Each cell continued to do its work, obeying genetic instructions, responding to local chemical signals, refining form and function. You were becoming more complex by the hour. Your eyes, though still closed, had fully developed retinas. Your skin was thickening and layering. Your lungs were beginning to produce surfactant, a substance that would one day prevent your air sacs from collapsing as you took your first breath. You had come a long way from that single cell. Over 10 trillion cells were now cooperating inside you, and not one of them had consciousness, yet together they were building a being that soon would. A being that might one day build rockets, write poetry, or complain about traffic. By week 21, you were beginning to accumulate more fat, slowly rounding out from your earlier, more angular form. That soft layer was not just for warmth. It would help regulate your metabolism and serve as a long-term energy reserve. Your eyebrows and eyelashes were forming. Your eyelids, still fused shut, hid developing eyes that had grown in complexity over recent weeks. Though you couldn't see in the traditional sense, your optic nerves were transmitting signals, and you could detect light shining faintly through the uterine wall. Inside your ears, the cochlea, a spiral-shaped organ essential for hearing, had fully formed. The brain's auditory centers were now active. And you could hear not just muffled internal sounds like your mother's heartbeat or the flow of blood, but external sounds too. Music, conversation, or the gentle hum of household appliances could reach you in distorted, underwater tones. It was your first exposure to the sensory landscape of the outside world. Your heartbeat, beating steadily at around 140 beats per minute, could be picked up clearly during a routine examination. Your fingers, complete with unique prints, were now actively exploring your surroundings. You could grab the umbilical cord, touch your own face, or nudge at the uterine wall. Movements were no longer random but increasingly coordinated. The connections between brain and muscle were strengthening, and practice made perfect. At week 22, you weighed around 430 grams and measured nearly 28 centimeters long. While you still had a lot of growing to do, the basic architecture of your organs was complete. The lungs were developing air sacs, or alveoli, and capillaries were forming networks to support future gas exchange. You weren't breathing yet, but the foundations of breath were assembling like scaffolding around a cathedral waiting for the choir. You now experience sleep cycles. Though not like adult sleep, you entered periods of deep rest and activity. Rapid eye movement, the stage of sleep associated with dreaming, was detectable. What dreams might emerge in the mind of a fetus? It's hard to say. More likely, the brain was processing signals, refining circuits, and doing general maintenance, like a janitor cleaning before the grand opening. By week 23, your skin, still translucent, began to show pigmentation as melanocyte cells responsible for skin color matured and distributed melanin. Your sense of touch was improving rapidly, and the areas of your brain responsible for tactile sensation were becoming more defined. If someone pressed on your mother's belly, you might feel it and respond with a tiny kick or twist. At week 24, your lungs reached a significant milestone. The cells responsible for producing surfactant, a chemical that reduces surface tension in the alveoli, were now active. This substance would be critical if you were born prematurely. Without it, your lungs would struggle to inflate. With it, your chances of survival outside the womb increased significantly. This week marked a threshold of viability. You were still extremely fragile, but with intensive care. It was now possible, though rare, for a baby at this stage to survive. Your facial features became more defined. Your lips, nostrils, and eyelids looked strikingly similar to how they would appear after birth. Your taste buds were functioning, and you could detect the flavors diffusing into the amniotic fluid. Studies suggest that preferences for certain tastes may begin in utero, shaped by the mother's diet. You weren't choosing your favorite foods just yet, but your tongue was taking notes. At week 25, your nervous system matured enough to begin controlling some bodily functions. You could now respond more systematically to changes in your environment, like increased light or a sudden noise. Your hands, more coordinated than ever, were capable of grasping and holding for short periods. Inside your brain, the cortex was expanding in complexity, folding into characteristic grooves and ridges that dramatically increased its surface area. You were now nearly 35 centimeters long and weighed over 600 grams. Your bone marrow had taken over as the primary site of blood cell production, and your immune system was beginning to develop. Antibodies from your mother were crossing the placenta, quietly preparing your body for its first encounter with the microbial world. At week 26, your eyes, still sealed for protection, began opening. You could now blink. Though your vision was limited, you were capable of detecting changes in light and dark. Your pupils could respond to brightness. That first blink marked the beginning of a sensory revolution. You were now aware not just of sound and motion, but of light itself. A distant cousin of perception that would one day help you gaze at stars or navigate through a library. You were also practicing breathing more seriously. Though submerged in fluid, your chest rose and fell rhythmically, mimicking the actions of postnatal respiration. These movements helped your lungs grow stronger and taught your diaphragm the rhythm it would one day repeat countless times per hour. Week 27 saw the development of the cerebral cortex accelerate. This outer layer of the brain, responsible for reasoning, memory, language, and consciousness, was organizing itself rapidly. You were not yet capable of rational thought, but the platform for that incredible leap was under construction. Meanwhile, your brain was beginning to regulate body temperature and direct more of your movement. By week 28, you had passed a significant milestone in size and complexity. You measured over 37 centimeters and weighed around 1 kilogram. You could now open and close your eyelids and even respond to light shining directly onto your mother's abdomen. Your sleep-wake cycles were more regular. You were storing calcium, iron, and phosphorus for bone development. From this point forward, you focused less on building new parts and more on refining and growing what had already formed. Your lungs continued maturing. Your brain continued folding and connecting, and your fat stores thickened. You were transitioning from a delicate architectural marvel into a baby capable of life outside the womb. Week 29 saw improvements in muscle tone and reflexes. Your kicks grew stronger. You could flex and stretch with more force. The fine hairs covering your body, lanugo, began to shed, though some would remain until after birth. Your brain's white matter was increasing rapidly, insulating your neurons for faster signal transmission. By week 30, your senses were sharper than ever. You could distinguish your mother's voice from others. You could hear music clearly. Some studies even suggest that lullabies played during pregnancy can be recognized by newborns. Whether you had preferences was another matter, but the wiring for future memories was being laid. You were gaining weight steadily now, about 200 grams per week. Your organs, nearly complete, were growing in size and function. Your movements were becoming less acrobatic and more intentional. The space in the womb was getting tighter, but you weren't done rehearsing. Not yet. You had a final trimester to refine your systems and prepare for the ultimate migration. By week 31, your nervous system was coordinating more with your cardiovascular and respiratory systems. Your red blood cells, once produced mostly by your liver, were now fully the responsibility of your bone marrow. Your digestive tract, though not yet processing real food, was nearly complete. You had cycles of wakefulness. You could sense temperature changes, and your body fat percentage had risen, rounding your face and limbs, giving you the soft appearance of a newborn. Week 32, your fingernails and toenails were fully grown. Your skin, once thin and fragile, had thickened and smoothed. You were now approximately 42 centimeters long and weighed about 1.7 kilograms. You had less room to move, but could still shift position, stretch, and hiccup. Your brain was still growing at a phenomenal rate, consuming over half of the energy available to your body. You weren't thinking in words or pictures, but electrical activity in your brain suggested rudimentary processing of the world around you. A distant echo of what would become consciousness, a light flickering behind a thick curtain, had begun to glow. You were no longer just becoming human in form. You were inching toward becoming human in awareness. And all of this, from a single fertilized cell, had taken only about 7 months. You had gone from invisible to visible, from formless to fantastically formed, from floating genetic potential to a full biological presence. Yet the transformation was not over. The final weeks would see an explosion in refinement, connectivity, and preparation. Your journey was nearing its final, most dramatic chapter. By week 33, the transformation within your body had reached an astonishing degree of complexity. Your lungs, now highly vascularized and filled with maturing alveoli, were preparing. For the moment, they would take in air for the first time. Surfactant production had increased dramatically, ensuring that when you finally entered the world, those tiny air sacs would stay open and allow oxygen to enter your bloodstream. In the womb, your breathing was only a simulation, shallow, rhythmic movements of your chest, but these dry runs were crucial for survival in the atmosphere that awaited. You were now more active during certain times of the day, cycling between restful stillness and lively squirms. With the womb becoming ever tighter, your movements were more subtle, not the full somersaults of weeks past, but nudges, rolls, and foot presses against the uterine wall. You responded more predictably to sounds. Someone sang nearby, you might turn your head toward the vibration. If a sudden loud noise startled your mother, your heartbeat might spike in response. Your autonomic nervous system was linking to your emotional centers, forming primitive stress and comfort responses. By week 34, your bones were nearly fully developed. Although still soft and pliable, a necessary feature for navigating the narrow passageway of the birth canal. Your skull was particularly special. Its bones remained unfused, leaving soft spots called fontanelles that allowed flexibility during delivery. These same gaps would also permit brain growth in your first year of life. Your toenails had reached the tips of your toes. Your skin, now a healthy pink instead of the earlier reddish transparency, had thickened and formed several layers. Fat deposits continued building up under your skin, smoothing the sharp contours of your earlier fetal frame. You now looked unmistakably like a newborn, just not quite full-sized. Your brain was consuming more energy than any other organ. It had developed folds, gyri, and sulci that increased its surface area and capacity for information processing. Electrical activity spiked in waves, revealing the presence of organized neural firing. You weren't yet thinking about the world, but your brain was rehearsing for perception, memory, and learning. Millions of new connections formed each day. By week 35, you were becoming noticeably heavier, about 2.4 kilograms now, and nearing 46 centimeters in length. The womb had grown snug. Your curled-up position resembled how you'd appear after birth. Knees drawn up, arms tucked in, spine gently curved. Space was limited, and the pressure helped encourage you into a head-down position. Though some fetuses remained stubbornly breech, positioning was becoming important. Nature was making plans for departure. Your kidneys were now fully capable of filtering blood and producing urine. Your liver was performing many of its future metabolic duties. Meanwhile, your immune system, though still immature, was becoming more independent. Antibodies passed from your mother's bloodstream into yours, offering passive immunity. Your skin was now largely free of lanugo, though small patches might still remain. The waxy vernix covering your body was beginning to shed into the amniotic fluid. Week 36 marked the beginning of what doctors call late preterm. Babies born at this stage often require only minimal medical intervention. Your lungs, though still maturing, were generally able to function. Your digestive system, while not yet tested with real food, had everything in place for nutrition processing. Your sucking reflex was strong. If someone placed a finger near your lips, you would instinctively open your mouth. The coordination required to suck, swallow, and breathe, essential for feeding, was becoming refined. At week 37, you had officially entered the window of early term. You weighed over 2.8 kilograms and measured nearly 49 centimeters. Your movements were deliberate. You had favorite resting positions. If music played, your heartbeat might adjust rhythmically. Your brain was undergoing a final wave of cortical refinement. The white matter that insulated your neural pathways increased. Synaptic pruning began, a process where unused connections were quietly eliminated to streamline brain efficiency. Now your fingernails extended beyond the tips of your fingers. Your body proportions had normalized. Your chest expanded noticeably with each practice breath. If someone tapped on the womb, you might blink or turn your head. Your pupils, newly responsive to light, could dilate and constrict. Though you could not see clearly, your visual system was tuned to detect high-contrast shapes, precisely the kind of faces you'd soon encounter. By week 38, you were considered full-term. Your organs had finished development. Your fat stores were complete. Your vernix had almost entirely disappeared. Your intestines contained a dark green substance called meconium. Your first stool, a mixture of shed cells, lanugo, and digestive secretions. You hadn't used your digestive system for nutrition yet, but it was ready to go. The womb, once spacious, was now crowded. Your placenta was still delivering oxygen and nutrients, but its function would soon reach its peak. Hormonal signals between you and your mother were beginning to shift. A complex cocktail of biological messages was preparing both of you for what came next. Your adrenal glands, small glands near your kidneys, were producing large amounts of cortisol, a stress hormone that not only helped prepare your lungs, but also initiated labor. At week 39, you had very likely assumed the classic birthing position. Head down, tucked chin, arms close, legs drawn in. Your weight hovered around 3.2 kilograms, and your length measured about 51 centimeters. You were, by all definitions, a fully formed human minus some final finishing touches. Your brain continued refining its connections. Your hearing was sharp. Your ability to respond to familiar voices, especially your mother's, was well documented. Your skull remained soft and moldable. The fontanelles, the gaps between cranial bones, would remain open for several months after birth. This flexibility would allow your head to pass through the birth canal. Even your shoulders had developed mechanisms to slightly overlap for easier delivery. Your lungs now produced enough surfactant to prevent collapse. If you cried after birth, it wouldn't be out of sadness, just the reflexive action of breathing and vocalizing all at once. Week 40 arrived with the quiet tension of an orchestra moments before the conductor's baton drops. Your development had reached its final phase. You were now over 3.4 kilograms in weight and nearly 52 centimeters in length. All your organs were functional. Your immune system was primed. Your skin was smooth, pink, and well protected. Your reflexes, grasping, rooting, sucking, stepping, were all present, though untested. Then came the signals. A shift in hormone levels, a release of oxytocin. Your mother's uterus began to contract. The placenta, sensing the change, altered its behavior. You felt the gentle rhythm of pressure, increasing steadily. Your head pressed downward. The cervix softened, thinned, and dilated. Labor had begun. You were unaware of the effort, the sweat, the cries, the emotion, the expectation waiting on the other side. You were simply responding to ajoiled instincts. Your head moved through the birth canal. Your skull plates shifted to accommodate the tight passage. You twisted slightly, turned, descended further. Then, after what must have seemed like a great squeeze of the universe, you emerged. For the first time, your lungs expanded. Air, crisp and cold compared to the fluid warmth you'd known, rushed in. The alveoli opened, blood shifted direction. The umbilical cord pulsed one final time, and you cried. Not from sadness, not from shock, but because your brain, lungs, throat, diaphragm were now doing something completely new, working together in open air. You were no longer a fetus. You were a newborn. A baby, a tiny human who had grown from a single fertilized cell into a body of over 70 trillion cooperating, communicating, pulsating cells. You had developed more than 200 distinct cell types. Your organs were perfectly interdependent. Your brain, while still immature, was more complex than any machine humanity had ever built. It had taken 9 months, 40 weeks, around 280 days. But really, the journey had only just begun. Now that you had emerged from the protected world of the womb, your first days as a human being were a flurry of adjustments. The soft light, strange sounds, cooler temperatures, and physical sensations were all brand new. Your lungs, having spent months practicing in fluid, were now inflated with air, and they would continue to do so about 20 to 40 times per minute. That was your first real job, breathing regularly and effectively, a task your body took seriously and never stopped performing from that moment onward. Meanwhile, your circulatory system underwent one of its most dramatic changes. In the womb, oxygen had come from the placenta delivered through the umbilical cord. Blood flowed through bypass vessels that skipped the lungs entirely. But with your first breaths, those temporary shunts, including the foramen ovale and the ductus arterius, began to close. Your heart adjusted to the new flow pattern, directing blood to your now active lungs. Your blood pressure, oxygen levels, and circulation patterns all changed in a matter of minutes. You weren't aware of any of it, of course. Your brain, though powerful, was still under construction. The cerebral cortex, the part responsible for conscious thought, memory, and language, was far from complete. At birth, your brain weighed about 350 grams, roughly a quarter of its eventual adult mass. But it was already forming up to 1 million new neural connections per second, a process that would continue at astonishing speed for the first few years of life. Your sense of hearing was the most developed of your senses at birth. You could recognize your mother's voice, which had echoed through the fluid for months. High-pitched tones attracted your attention. Loud noises might startle you. Vision was less precise. Your retinas functioned, but the muscles controlling your eye movement were weak, and the parts of your brain that interpreted visual input were still maturing. You could see about 20 to 30 centimeters, just enough to focus on the face of someone holding you. Your sense of smell was surprisingly acute. Within days, you could identify your mother by scent alone. Your taste buds were tuned to prefer sweet over bitter, a preference that made sense given your new diet of milk. Your skin, though sensitive, was still adjusting to the dry air. Gone was the cushioning amniotic fluid, replaced by fabrics, arms, and the odd sensation of open space. Over the following weeks, your body continued its breakneck pace of development. Your brain was growing, forming pathways for basic motor control. Reflexes dominated your behavior. The rooting reflex helped you find food. The grasp reflex let you hold a finger tightly. These involuntary actions were leftover instructions from the womb, but would gradually give way to purposeful movement. Your muscles were still weak. Holding your head upright required effort, and sitting up unassisted was months away. But your limbs jerked with sudden energy, a sign that your nervous system was wiring itself, experimenting with signals between brain and body. Myelination, the insulation of nerve fibers, accelerated rapidly now. With each passing week, your control improved. By 3 months, you had developed enough core strength to lift your head during tummy time. You could smile in response to faces. You began cooing, an early form of communication that delighted adults and tested your lungs and vocal cords. Your vision sharpened, and you could track moving objects. Neurons in your visual cortex fired in synchronized patterns, building the circuits that would one day let you read, recognize faces, and interpret colors. By 4 months, your motor skills improved. You could grasp objects intentionally, not just reflexively. You brought your hands to your mouth, a favorite form of exploration. Your brain continued growing at incredible speed. Sleep remained essential. You spent over 15 hours a day in varying sleep states, and during those quiet hours, your brain filed information, built pathways, and conducted maintenance. At 6 months, you were a bundle of curiosity. You could sit with support, roll over, both ways, and even bear weight on your legs when held upright. Your laughter emerged, a uniquely human sound, as your social brain blossomed. You recognized familiar faces, reacted to new voices, and began to show preference for caregivers. Inside your mouth, teeth were forming beneath the gums. Your digestive system had matured to the point where small amounts of pureed foods could be introduced. Your intestines were longer, your enzyme production had increased, and your stomach had doubled in volume since birth. At 9 months, you had likely learned to crawl. Your hands opened and closed with dexterity. You picked up small items using a pincer grip, thumb and forefinger working together like precision tools. You babbled with rhythm, combining sounds in a way that hinted at your future language ability. Your memory extended beyond the present moment. You began to recognize patterns, the sound of a favorite lullaby, the smell of a particular blanket, the timing of daily routines. Your brain now weighed over 800 grams. The number of synapses, connections between neurons, had exploded. In some regions, such as the visual cortex, you had twice as many synapses as an adult. This surplus of connections was like an overgrown forest, and in the coming years, your brain would prune it back, preserving only the pathways you used most. By 12 months, you were capable of standing, maybe even taking a few shaky steps. Your vocabulary included simple words like mama or dada, though the meaning attached to those sounds was still blooming. You could understand far more than you could say. You pointed to objects, responded to your name, and followed simple instructions. Your immune system was stronger, supported by vaccines and natural exposure. Your gut microbiome, a bustling community of helpful bacteria, had established itself. You could digest a variety of foods. Your liver processed nutrients efficiently. Your kidneys filtered waste like seasoned professionals. Your heart had slowed from its newborn rate of 160 beats per minute to closer to 120. Your respiratory rate had decreased. Your bones, once soft and rubbery, had hardened considerably. Your limbs grew rapidly. Your spine straightened. You were growing into the proportions of a toddler. At 18 months, your understanding of language exploded. You went from a few words to several dozen. You could point to body parts, mimic adult behaviors, and express preferences. The parts of your brain responsible for emotion, reward, and memory, particularly the limbic system, were now in full swing. Tantrums, laughter, and delight all arose from the same rich network. You could now walk with confidence, climb stairs, stack blocks, open drawers you were absolutely not supposed to open. Your fingers were nimble, your curiosity endless. Your brain had begun specializing, reducing the number of unused synapses while strengthening those that helped you interact with the world. By the time you were 2 years old, your vocabulary exceeded 200 words. You could form 2-word sentences. You understood cause and effect. You showed signs of empathy, frustration, joy, and pride. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of decision-making, was still in its early development, which explained your impulsiveness and occasional lapses in judgment, like the decision to put a sandwich in the DVD player. Your body had grown significantly. Your weight had tripled since birth. Your bones had lengthened. Your coordination had improved. You were building a map of your world through experience. Every touch, sound, and sight was recorded in the great biological database of your nervous system. You were no longer just a small version of yourself. You were a person, shaped by biology and increasingly by experience. The journey from a single cell to a walking, talking, emotionally rich human had taken about 730 days. And yet, you were still at the very beginning of a process that would continue reshaping your body and mind for decades. You would come from one cell, one invisible spark of molecular orchestration. And now you were a constellation of cells, memories, and motion, standing on your own 2 feet, ready for everything that came next. As your 3rd year began, the transformation continued with quiet urgency. Though your size increased more gradually, now your brain raced ahead, refining its structure with stunning precision. The once excessive tangle of neural connections began to simplify through a process known as synaptic pruning, a biological version of editing a messy first draft. Neurons that fired together became stronger. Connections that remained unused disappeared. What remained was a faster, more efficient brain, one tuned by experience and repetition. At 3 years old, your vocabulary had likely grown to over 1,000 words. You spoke in short sentences, asked endless questions, and repeated phrases like a parrot with a mission. Language areas in your brain, particularly Broca's and Wernicke's regions, had matured to the point where syntax and tone could be manipulated, even if grammar still lagged behind. You were experimenting with communication as much as you were with gravity and crayons. Your memory was improving rapidly. You could now remember routines, names, places, and short narratives. Events had begun to settle into long-term storage, forming the earliest stable memories you would carry into adulthood. Many of those first memories were tied to strong emotions: surprise, fear, joy, because the amygdala, the brain's emotional processor, tagged those experiences with extra attention. Physically, you became more agile. You could run, jump, climb, and balance on 1 foot. The cerebellum, tucked beneath the back of your brain, had fine-tuned your coordination. Muscles responded faster. Reflexes smoothed into fluid actions. Your bones lengthened, and the proportions of your face and limbs began to resemble those of a miniature adult. You were no longer a toddler in diapers waddling across the floor. You were a child, alert, animated, and utterly unpredictable. At 4 years old, your social brain kicked into high gear. You began to understand that other people had thoughts, feelings, and perspectives different from your own. This was the emergence of theory of mind, the realization that the world didn't revolve around your own internal story. Empathy became possible. Pretend play blossomed. You could create imaginary friends, act out complex stories, and assign personalities to toys. Your brain was beginning to simulate alternate realities, a skill that would one day serve you in literature, diplomacy, and online comment sections. Your immune system had now developed its own memory, having been exposed to common bacteria, viruses, and vaccines. Your body could respond faster and more effectively to future encounters. Your lymphatic system had matured. White blood cells patrolled your tissues like tiny bodyguards, ready to neutralize intruders. You were no longer protected solely by maternal antibodies. You had developed your own biological defenses. By age 5, your brain had reached about 90% of its adult size. Your skull had expanded accordingly, and the fontanelles had long since closed. The growth plates in your long bones remained active, allowing your legs and arms to lengthen steadily. You could hop, skip, throw, and catch with growing accuracy. Fine motor skills improved dramatically. You could now button a shirt, use scissors, and hold a pencil in something resembling a civilized grip. Cognitively, you could follow complex instructions. You understood time, at least in vague terms: yesterday, today, tomorrow. You could count, sort, and even recognize some letters and numbers. Your brain's prefrontal cortex, though still under construction, allowed for rudimentary planning, problem-solving, and impulse control. You might hesitate before grabbing a cookie off the counter, a sign that your frontal lobe was beginning to whisper advice, even if you occasionally ignored it. Socially, you sought approval and friendship. You understood fairness. You compared yourself to others. You could experience guilt. Emotional regulation improved thanks to maturing circuits between the amygdala and the frontal cortex. Tantrums became less common, replaced by negotiations, arguments, and questions that included the word why more times than most adults could tolerate. At age 6, the world changed again. You entered formal schooling. This marked a turning point, not just in environment, but in brain function. The ability to sit still, focus, and follow rules depended on rapid maturation of the frontal lobes. You learned to read, not just through memorization, but by decoding. Letters became sounds, sounds became words, and words opened doors to entire universes. Your hippocampus, the brain's librarian, grew more sophisticated. You could retain facts, events, and sequences. Your working memory improved. Math concepts emerged. You understood that numbers could represent quantities, relationships, and even abstract ideas. Your cognitive flexibility allowed you to shift between tasks, hold multiple thoughts, and see from different points of view. Physically, your growth continued at a steady pace. You gained about 2.5 kilograms per year. Your bones thickened. Muscles strengthened. Your coordination allowed for more complex sports, dancing, and climbing things you weren't supposed to. Your lungs expanded. Your cardiovascular system adapted to higher levels of activity. You had energy in reserve and burned it with enthusiasm. By age 7, your teeth were falling out, a sign that your body had entered a new phase of development. Baby teeth made way for permanent ones. Inside your bones, growth plates expanded with renewed vigor. Hormones began to stir, though puberty was still several years away. Your brain was now actively integrating knowledge from multiple senses, allowing you to think abstractly, visualize concepts, and imagine outcomes. At 8 and 9, your cognitive abilities matured in complexity. You could understand cause and effect, predict consequences, and reflect on your actions. Morality became more nuanced. You no longer just followed rules. You questioned them. You wanted to know why something was right or wrong. Your emotional awareness deepened. You experienced jealousy, pride, embarrassment, and sympathy sometimes, all in one school day. By age 10, you had crossed a quiet threshold. Your brain's plasticity, its ability to rewire itself, remained high, but was beginning to settle. Skills you had practiced repeatedly, like reading or riding a bike, became deeply embedded. Your processing speed increased. Reaction time decreased. The parts of your brain responsible for executive function, the prefrontal cortex and its network, strengthened further. Your identity began to take shape. You could now describe your likes, dislikes, beliefs, and dreams. You saw yourself as part of a group, a family, a culture, a team. You began to wonder not just how things worked, but why you were here. Philosophical questions crept in. Your consciousness, shaped by biology and molded by experience, expanded in dimension and depth. And all of this, the running, talking, dreaming, questioning person, had grown from that single fertilized cell. A zygote with no awareness, no direction of its own, but encoded with instructions so sophisticated they built a being who could ask where those instructions came from. The journey from cell to child wasn't a straight line. It was a cascade of branching pathways, feedback loops, and coordinated growth that somehow avoided chaos. A single cell had divided, specialized, organized, and refined itself into trillions of cells working in synchronized concert. You had gone from microscopic to monumental, from unthinking molecule to conscious mind, and you were just getting started. As you stepped into adolescence, your body prepared for one of its most extraordinary transformations since the womb. Around the age of 11 or 12, a quiet hormonal storm began to build beneath the surface. The hypothalamus, nestled deep within your brain, began to send chemical signals to the pituitary gland. These messages triggered a chain reaction that would alter nearly every system in your body. Puberty had arrived. In girls, estrogen and progesterone levels surged, initiating the development of breasts, widening hips, and the beginning of the menstrual cycle. In boys, testosterone flooded the bloodstream, deepening the voice, stimulating muscle growth, and triggering the enlargement of the testes and penis. In both, the adrenal glands contributed by producing androgens, hormones responsible for body hair, oil production, and changes in sweat composition. You might have noticed strange smells, sudden acne, or an urgent desire to use deodorant. Growth accelerated. During the peak of your adolescent growth spurt, your bones lengthened so rapidly that you might have experienced joint pain or a series of clumsy, limb-flailing mishaps. Your arms and legs stretched, your spine elongated, and your hands and feet reached adult proportions, sometimes before the rest of your body caught up. The growth plates in your long bones remained open, allowing for this rapid vertical expansion. Most of this skeletal elongation would conclude by your late teens, after which those plates would seal, locking in your final height. Internally, your heart grew in size and efficiency. The thickening of the left ventricle improved blood circulation, and resting heart rate decreased slightly. Your lungs expanded, boosting your aerobic capacity. Your muscle fibers increased in density and mass, particularly in males, while body fat distribution shifted. Girls typically accumulated more fat around the hips and thighs. Boys developed broader shoulders and leaner limbs. The shape of your body began to differentiate in clear, unmistakable ways. Neurologically, your brain entered a fascinating and tumultuous phase. Though you might have looked like an adult on the outside, the inside of your skull told a more complex story. Your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, impulse control, and long-term thinking, was still under construction. It would not reach full maturity until your mid-20s. In contrast, the limbic system, home to emotion, risk-taking, and reward-seeking, had become hyperactive. This imbalance explained a lot about adolescent behavior: bursts of bravery, mood swings, boundary testing, and a heightened sensitivity to social approval. Synaptic pruning resumed with renewed energy. Those extra connections formed in early childhood were now being trimmed. Neurons that fired together stayed together. Those left unused were marked for deletion. Your brain was fine-tuning itself, becoming faster, more efficient, and more specialized. White matter increased as myelin continued to coat axons, speeding up electrical transmission between distant regions of the brain. Emotionally, you developed a richer understanding of identity, belonging, and purpose. You began questioning not only how things worked, but who you were. Abstract thought emerged in full force. You considered concepts like justice, morality, love, and death with new depth. The ability to reflect on your own thoughts, metacognition, expanded. You weren't just aware. You were aware that you were aware. By the age of 16 or 17, your body had entered the final phase of physical maturation. Secondary sexual characteristics, breast development, facial hair, voice deepening, were complete or nearly so. Menstrual cycles became more regular in boys. Nocturnal emissions became common. In both, the reproductive system was fully functional. You had reached the biological definition of reproductive maturity, the moment when, in purely physical terms, you could create another life. Repeating the journey that brought you here. Your skeleton hardened. Growth plates fused. Your height plateaued. Your muscle-to-fat ratio settled into adult patterns. Bones increased in density and mineral content, especially during late adolescence. Peak bone mass, an important factor for lifelong health, was typically reached by your mid-20s. Your coordination improved dramatically. Clumsy elbows and Tripping over your own feet gave way to fluid movement and refined motor control. Cognitively, your frontal lobes continued developing. You began to think strategically. You could hold multiple variables in your head at once. You recognized paradoxes, challenged assumptions, and debated complex ideas. Emotional regulation improved. You could pause before reacting, weigh consequences, and even change your mind mid-thought. Decision-making became more mature, though. Not always consistent. The final wiring of judgment and restraint was still in progress. Socially, your world expanded beyond the family unit. Friendships deepened. Romantic interests emerged. You formed affiliations with groups, cultures, and causes. The search for identity intensified. You tried on different versions of yourself like outfits, exploring who fit where and what mattered most. While some of this was confusing, it was also essential. You weren't just building a body anymore, you were constructing a personality, a worldview, a narrative of self. By your early 20s, your physical growth was largely complete. Your brain reached its adult volume, about 1.4 kilograms, composed of roughly 86 billion neurons and an estimated 100 trillion synaptic connections. Your metabolic rate stabilized. Your organs had hit peak performance. Your immune system had learned to distinguish friend from foe. Your cardiovascular system was efficient. Your muscle mass had peaked. Your reproductive system functioned predictably. But beneath the surface, change never truly stopped. Your cells still divided, your body still repaired. Your bones remodeled, your muscles strengthened with use. Your neural circuits adapted to experience. The adult body was not a final form, but an ongoing project. Hormones still fluctuated. Emotions still shifted. New skills could be learned. New memories could be formed. Adaptation continued, slower, subtler, but always present. And remarkably, every single one of your trillions of cells could trace its lineage back to that first cell. The zygote that started it all. The instructions within your DNA had guided every transformation, which genes to express, when to divide, how to build bone or muscle or neuron. Yet the result wasn't a machine. It was a person. Conscious, reflective, capable of love, art, rebellion, and forgiveness. You had become fully human, not simply in form, but in function and depth. You are now capable of the very acts that shape the world around you. Learning, creating, influencing, and empathizing. You could look at the stars and wonder. You could examine your own past, project your future, and experience the present as a continuous stream of awareness. From cell to self, your journey had redefined complexity. And even though the construction phase was behind you, the unfolding narrative of who you were and who you could become remained open. Your body was complete, but your story was just beginning. By the time you reached your mid-20s, a curious stability settled over your biology. Growth had slowed, repairs continued on an as-needed basis, and your internal systems had become a well-coordinated symphony of ongoing maintenance. You weren't building a body anymore, you were running one. Like a city that had finished its last skyscraper, the scaffolding was gone, and the focus shifted from expansion to preservation. Your bones, fully fused and hardened, had reached their peak density. Osteoblasts and osteoclasts, the cells responsible for building and breaking down bone, remained active, but now worked primarily in remodeling rather than construction. This process ensured that even your skeletal system, though stable in shape, remained responsive to stress, exercise, and injury. If you took up rock climbing or weightlifting, your bones would quietly thicken in the regions that bore the most force. Your muscles maintained mass and strength, assuming you kept them active. Muscle fibers, long and elastic, contracted thousands of times a day without protest. With each motion, mitochondria inside those fibers produced ATP, the energy. currency that powered every twitch, stretch, and sprint. Your heart, a fist-sized marvel of endurance, beat over 100,000 times each day, pumping more than 7,000 liters of blood through a vast circulatory network that reached from scalp to soul. This system carried oxygen, nutrients, hormones, and immune cells, never resting, never hesitating. Your skin, the largest organ, had settled into a cycle of regeneration. Each square centimeter contained millions of cells, hundreds of nerve endings, dozens of sweat glands, and yards of capillaries. Every month, the outer layer sloughed off and renewed itself. Wounds healed, scars faded. Melanocytes monitored UV exposure. The skin was both armor and antenna, a living interface between the world and the biology within. Internally, your digestive system had become a seamless conveyor belt. From the first bite of food to the final absorption of nutrients, the journey took between 1 and 3 days. Your liver processed chemicals with unmatched efficiency, detoxifying blood, storing energy, and producing bile. Your kidneys filtered about 50 gallons of blood per day, excreting only what the body no longer needed. Meanwhile, trillions of microbes in your gut assisted in breaking down fibers, synthesizing vitamins, and protecting against harmful invaders. This ecosystem, your microbiome, was as unique as your fingerprint. Your reproductive systems, fully matured, operated with clockwork regularity. For females, cycles of ovulation and menstruation signaled the readiness of eggs, with complex, hormonal feedback loops orchestrating the timing. For males, sperm production continued continuously, with millions created each day. Both systems were self-regulating, flexible, and biologically prepared for the possibility of creating another new human being. Whether or not that happened depended on choices, not merely biology. Cognitively, your brain had achieved a delicate balance between flexibility and stability. The prefrontal cortex now fully matured, you could delay gratification, assess risk, navigate complex decisions, and manage conflicting emotions. Executive functions, planning, organization, inhibition, working memory were at their strongest. The neural circuitry supporting empathy, moral reasoning, and creativity was well connected. You could maintain multiple goals in mind at once. You could visualize your future, regret your past, and act deliberately in the present. Emotionally, your self-awareness deepened. You recognized not just your moods, but the origins behind them. You could experience awe, nostalgia, melancholy, and inspiration, emotions with subtle textures and no direct biological triggers. These were the products of memory, abstraction, and imagination, woven into the emotional fabric of consciousness. But even in this phase of equilibrium, your biology remained in quiet flux. Around age 30, you reached the first hints of a long, gradual transition, the beginning of aging. It didn't announce itself with drama. It whispered in small ways. Collagen production in your skin slowed, leading to less elasticity. Your metabolism began to decline, sometimes imperceptibly. Muscle mass, if not maintained, would gradually diminish. The rate of cell turnover decreased. DNA replication became slightly less accurate. The brain, while still remarkably plastic, began to show subtle changes in volume and connectivity. You might have noticed slightly slower recall, the tip of its tongue phenomenon becoming more familiar. This wasn't decline in ability, but a natural reorganization of information. Crystallized intelligence, accumulated knowledge and experience, increased while fluid intelligence, speed of reasoning, peaked and leveled. Yet none of these changes defined you. Instead, they became the terrain through which your life's experience traveled. With age came expertise. Neural shortcuts, built from years of pattern recognition, allowed you to solve problems faster and more intuitively. Emotional regulation improved. You were less reactive, more measured, Relationships grew deeper. Priorities shifted. By your 40s, the signs of aging were more visible. Hair grayed as pigment-producing cells in follicles reduced melanin output. Skin wrinkled from repeated expression and thinning connective tissue. Muscle tone required more intentional effort to maintain. Vision might change as the lens in your eye stiffened, reducing its ability to focus on nearby objects, a process called presbyopia. Reproductive changes became more pronounced. In women, perimenopause began, a period of hormonal fluctuation that could last several years. Ovulation became irregular. Estrogen and progesterone levels shifted. Symptoms like hot flashes, sleep changes, and mood variation might emerge. Men experienced a slower, less dramatic transition, often referred to as andropause. Testosterone levels declined gradually, influencing muscle mass, libido, and energy levels. Despite these changes, most bodily systems remained robust. Heart health could be maintained through activity and diet. Bones could be strengthened. The brain, especially when challenged with new learning or physical exercise, could continue generating new neurons in certain regions. Aging was not a switch, but a slope, gentle in descent, punctuated by individual choices and environmental factors. By the age of 50, your body had weathered half a century of movement, sensation, illness, and repair. Your cells had turned. Over countless times, your immune system, though somewhat less efficient, still defended you daily. Your senses, though slightly dulled, still filled your world with flavor, color, and rhythm. Your brain, seasoned and experienced, understood more than it could when it was faster, not less intelligent, but differently wise. And even then, your biology did not quit. It adapted. Your body from that first single cell had never aimed for immortality, it aimed for resilience. Every stage of life, from zygote to adult, was a phase of continual adaptation to changing environments. Life was not just built to last, it was built to change. And you were its most complex expression. From one microscopic origin, you had become a complete organism, capable of reflecting on itself, tracing its development, and wondering how it all came to be. You were built to grow, to think, to remember, to care, to forget, and to love. And you still were not finished. As you moved into your 60s and 70s, the slow arc of aging curved gently downward. But the story of your biology remained one of adaptation, compensation, and astonishing continuity. Every system in your body, from immune to endocrine, skeletal to neurological, still operated according to the same molecular logic it had followed since your first cell divided. Only now, the tempo had shifted. Repairs took longer. Responses were less vigorous, yet the organism, you, remained remarkably capable. Your bones, once dynamic builders of height and structure, now leaned toward preservation. Osteoblast activity declined, and osteoclasts, the cells responsible for breaking down bone, held the upper hand. This led to gradual loss in bone density, especially in postmenopausal women, due to reduced estrogen levels. Your vertebrae might compress slightly, your posture subtly change, your frame become a little more fragile. But bones still repaired when broken, still responded to load and motion, and still quietly supported your entire form. Muscle mass, without deliberate use, decreased steadily in a process called sarcopenia. Around 1% of muscle mass could be lost each year after 50, if not counteracted by physical activity. The result wasn't just less strength, but reduced mobility and balance, a risk for falls and injury. But even in your 70s, new muscle fibers could grow. New mitochondria could multiply, and your body could respond positively to resistance. Training, it had not forgotten how to change. Your cardiovascular system, though still tireless, bore the marks of time. Arteries stiffened. Blood pressure often rose. The heart's walls thickened slightly, pumping less efficiently. But your heart, which had beaten over 2.5 billion times since birth, continued with unwavering determination. A healthy lifestyle could preserve cardiac function well into advanced age. With walking, movement, and breath still fueling every cell that depended on oxygen's delicate arrival, the lungs, too, changed. Their elasticity decreased, the diaphragm weakened, and the alveoli merged in places, reducing surface area. This meant that deep breaths became slightly more difficult, and the oxygen exchange slightly less efficient. But your body compensated by increasing breathing rate when needed, and lung capacity could still be trained through deliberate breathing exercises and cardiovascular activity. Your digestive system, while largely intact, also mellowed. Saliva production declined. The esophagus moved food more slowly. Stomach acid production dipped. Absorption in the small intestine became less efficient, and the large intestine could become sluggish. But the system as a whole remained functional. Enzymes still broke down food. Nutrients still traveled through the bloodstream. The gut microbiome, though shifting in composition, continued to support immune and metabolic health. And the immune system, once a robust army of naive, eager defenders, became quieter. Fewer new T cells were produced. Inflammation increased subtly across the body, a condition known as inflammaging. Recovery from illness took longer. Vaccines sometimes provoked a weaker response. Yet even here, memory remained. Your body still recognized familiar pathogens. Antibodies persisted in the bloodstream like tiny guardians recalling past battles. In your nervous system, the most delicate changes were underway. Some neurons died, especially in memory-related areas like the hippocampus. Synaptic plasticity, the ability to form new connections, declined. Processing speed slowed. Recalling names, dates, and details became more effortful. But other faculties remained strong or even improved. Vocabulary, general knowledge, emotional regulation, and social understanding often deepened with age. Wisdom emerged from the sediment of experience. Your senses, vision, hearing, taste, and touch became gentler in their delivery. Eyesight required stronger lenses. Night vision dimmed. Hearing faded in high frequencies. Taste dulled slightly. Touch became less precise. But none of these senses disappeared entirely. They simply required new kinds of attentiveness, louder conversations, more lighting, deeper appreciation of the textures you could still enjoy. And emotionally, something quietly beautiful took place. Many older adults reported greater satisfaction with life, more emotional stability, and less anxiety about short-term concerns. The brain's default mode network, responsible for internal reflection, remained active. You became more introspective, more accepting of life's uncertainties, more capable of placing your experiences within a broader human story. At the cellular level, senescence, the state where cells stop dividing but don't die, became more common. These aging cells contributed to chronic inflammation and reduced tissue repair. Telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes, had shortened significantly, limiting how many times a cell could safely divide. But these changes were not failures. They were programmed. They were part of the natural design of a biological system optimized for growth, reproduction, and resilience, not indefinite duration. Still, regeneration didn't cease entirely. Skin wounds healed, muscles repaired, neurons formed new branches. The brain rewired itself in response to new learning. Even in your 70s, you could learn a new language, pick up an instrument, or form new friendships. The myth that aging brought only decline had been replaced by a deeper truth. Aging was complex, diverse, and partially within your influence. By the time you entered your 80s or 90s, if you were fortunate to do so, the edges of existence softened, physical strength waned, bones grew lighter, muscles shrank. The immune system required greater protection. Sleep patterns shifted. Dreams became lighter. But mental clarity could persist. Creativity could flourish, and purpose could remain sharp. And throughout it all, from the first breath to the last blink, the body never stopped responding to its environment. Every cell, organ, hormone, meant heartbeat had been shaped not only by biology, but by experience. The food you ate, the people you loved, the places you lived, the thoughts you entertained. You weren't a machine winding down. You were a story unfolding. A dynamic equilibrium. And when the final chapter approached, whether at 95 or beyond 100, your body, long, resilient, and responsive, began the process of letting go. The systems that had sustained you slowly reduced their rhythm. Organs, once tirelessly active, paused. The brain, the last to fall silent, released its final signal. And it all ended where it had begun, at the cellular level. Yet the mystery remained: how a single microscopic cell could generate a lifetime of thoughts, laughter, heartbreak, invention, and memory. You had been a child, an adult, a teacher, a learner, a seeker, and a home to all the atoms that had passed through you. You were both biology and biography. A person not just built by cells, but lived by stories, from cell to human to history. In the quiet aftermath of a human life, something extraordinary still unfolds. Though the person is gone, the body remains momentarily whole, a final arrangement of all the systems that once moved in concert. The heart no longer beats. The lungs no longer expand. Neurons fall silent. Yet even here, at the boundary between life and its absence, the biological story doesn't stop. It only shifts form. Cells, once synchronized in their shared purpose of sustaining consciousness, begin to revert. In the absence of oxygen, ATP production halts, and the chemical gradients that powered nerve impulses, muscle contractions, and metabolic reactions collapse. But before breakdown comes a strange flurry of activity, a last chaotic attempt by cells to maintain equilibrium, to resist the irreversible. Within hours, tissues begin the process of autolysis, self-digestion. Enzymes that once worked neatly within lysosomes now leak into the cytoplasm, breaking down proteins, lipids, and organelles. The body enters a phase of quiet disassembly, not with violence, but with biological logic. This was not failure. It was transition. Every living organism, from single-celled bacteria to multicellular mammals, carried within it the instructions for both building and dismantling. Soon, microbes begin their work. The gut, once home to a cooperative community of bacteria, now becomes the origin point of decomposition. These microorganisms, no longer kept in check by the immune system, begin to consume their host. They digest carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, releasing gases that expand tissues. The body changes in appearance. But even this process, often misunderstood or feared, is simply biology repurposing biology. Over the following days and weeks, insects arrive. Soil organisms join in. Scavengers might contribute. Every part of the body, from skin to bone, becomes incorporated into new systems. Nutrients re-enter the food chain. Elements like calcium, phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon find new destinations. They are taken up by plants, consumed by animals, dissolved into water. What was once singular becomes multiple. What was once organized becomes potential. And this is where the journey returns to its beginning. Every atom in your body, the iron in your blood, the calcium in your teeth, the carbon in your DNA, had existed long before you were born. Most were formed in ancient stars, fused in stellar cores, and scattered across the galaxy by supernova. You were quite literally made of stardust, gathered by gravity, rearranged by chemistry, and animated by biology. And when your life ended, those atoms remained. They did not vanish. They simply changed roles. Even your DNA, the intricate molecule that directed your development from a single cell, could live on. If you had children, parts of it were passed to them. If not, it might still persist in databases, tissue samples, or even in the memories of those who knew you, who had been shaped by your choices and presence. The human body, while finite, casts echoes that last. What made you, your thoughts, emotions, beliefs, identity, may not leave biological footprints in the same way, but they were no less real. Every word you spoke, every act of kindness, every discovery, every story you shared, these became part of the social organism of humanity. Your influence spread outward, not as molecules, but as meaning. And yet, long before all of this, before your words, your laughter, your thoughts, there was only a single cell. Just one, microscopic, fragile, unaware, but within it lay the totality of possibility. A zygote, formed by the fusion of egg and sperm, containing 23 pairs of chromosomes, a few picograms of genetic material, and a universe of potential. In just 9 months, it built a baby. In 20 years, it built a mind capable of imagination and love. In 80 years, it lived an entire arc of memories, growth, decisions, and consequences. And then it returned to where it began, not in oblivion, but in continuation. The human journey from cell to self to dust is not a cycle of loss, but of transformation. Life isn't something you possess. It's something you participate in. It moves through you, reshapes you, and then moves on, into the grass, the air, the words of others, the curiosity of children, the cells of the next person to emerge. And through it all, the story of how a single cell becomes a human remains one of the most intricate, awe-inspiring, and humbling narratives science has ever uncovered. Thank you for watching this video on the Sleepless Scientist channel, the place where science becomes soft enough to sleep beside. We hope you found peace in the rhythms of biology and wonder in the logic of life. We're grateful you joined us on this journey from one cell to many, from potential to person. We're sorry if this story made it harder to sleep or gave you more questions than answers. But if it sparked curiosity even for a moment, then your brain has done exactly what it was built to do. Please like, subscribe, and comment below. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you relaxing in the late hours of the night? Just waking up? Somewhere in between. Now, as you ease into rest, let the last traces of this story drift away. No more facts, no more figures, no more reflections. Only the soft sound of breath, the steady rhythm of your own heartbeat, and the deep knowledge that you are, and always have been, the miracle of biology in motion. Good night.